Happy to be here. I was pleased to present this topic at the most recent LCA conference in Charleston and participate in the panel that was there, and happy to present it to a potentially wider audience today. And the special part about today is that I have my colleague Greg Roberts with me, who was not able to attend the Charleston conference, but can certainly speak to this project remotely. So today we're going to focus on how LCA can help support the development of an environmental management system in ISO 14001. And just briefly, a little bit about RAMBOLL. We are a consulting firm that serves a variety of markets: buildings, transport, environment and health, water, energy, oil and gas, and design and management consulting. And we at RAMBOLL ENVIRON, we focus on the environmental and health aspects, including compliance as well as sustainability consulting, and things like environmental management systems 14001. And so we're happy to enable sustainable societies and provide those services. All right, so what are we going to talk about today? In 2015, there was a new ISO 14001 standard, well, an update to the existing standard, I should say, and it had an increased focus on life cycle thinking. And so it's easy to see how life cycle assessment can help focus those efforts, and that's what we're going to talk about. And then towards the end, I will talk about a case study as well. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Greg, and he's going to talk about 14001.
Okay, well, good morning all. My name is Greg Roberts. Thank you very much, Jim. Thanks all for joining us to talk through ISO 14001. I'm hopeful that you can see my screen now. And what I want to do is just give you an introduction into what happened in 2015 when the new version of ISO 14001 came into being. You'll see in front of you sort of the 5 main changes of ISO 14001. There are other more subtle changes, but most of the main conceptual changes you can see in those 5 areas in front of you. The first one, top of the list, really has to be around leadership and commitment. Leadership and commitment was something that was within the original 14001, but certainly was something that was strengthened in this latest version. It's a requirement in its own right, but of course none of the others, 2 to 5, are possible without leadership and commitment being in place, including number 5 about life cycle. ISO 14001 also required about us understanding the context of the organisation. Far too often organisations set up an environmental management system and it failed to really progress and maintain improvement because they really weren't able to understand some of the barriers that the EMS faced. Very importantly, something that we'll be discussing later is that ISO 14001 recognises that people want to know more about organisations, can find out more about organisations, and of course our environmental performance is very much based upon our stakeholders and how we communicate with them. So there's a lot more greater focus on that, on being external with our environmental performance than perhaps we were previously. And number 4 is a great addition because it talks about risks, opportunities. Something that ISO 14001 was accused of before was it was quite a sort of niche subject. We talked about environmental management, and it was often the responsibility of one person in the organisation to manage environmental management. By talking about things like context, by talking about things like risks and opportunities, it makes the management system more mainstream within the organisation, and it's so much easier to engage top management in the process because it's not just about environmental performance, it's also about improving the performance of the organisation as well. So that's 1 through to 4, but the focus of today's conversation is what ISO 14001 2015 brought in was this whole idea about thinking life cycle and taking account of a life cycle perspective. Many of you will be familiar with organizations, perhaps with their environmental management systems, and you may be aware that a lot of those management systems often focus on the If it was a manufacturing organization, the manufacturing part of the environmental management system. You know, what do we do on our site? What waste do we generate? What energy do we use? That organization could fail to see that they also produce a product or provide a service, that they buy lots of things. All of these aspects tended to be given very minor detail in the environmental management systems before. The environmental management systems would improve the environmental performance of the organisation, but many environmental management systems are now probably struggling to improve unless they start thinking about the wider life cycle in addition to their own on-site performance. So what's appearing on the screen, I probably have to give a little overview of, given the audience. But interesting, this is the life cycle as ISO 14001 sees it. Myself and Jim have had discussions about this, and I know that there will be sort of discussions around why they've chosen certain wording and had certain stages, but that's what was agreed by ISO and for ISO 14001. That said, an organisation can change the descriptions to meet its own purposes. I recently did some work with an airport, and it was quite interesting for them to try and understand where they fitted within a life cycle. What was their life cycle? You know, they don't produce a product as such, they provide a service. And we went about changing some of the terms that were actually on this diagram in front of you. The reason why I put this on the screen is because I want to show you what does ISO 14001 specifically require in relation to life cycle perspective. The first thing, and very importantly what it requires us to do, is identify aspects at each stage of the life cycle. Aspects is a word that's used in ISO 14001, but essentially we are talking about things that can interact with the environment, and we think about environmental impacts associated with those aspects. So the first thing we do, if you like, is a risk assessment to try and understand where the biggest environmental impacts are across the life cycle. That's really important because the environmental management system is built upon managing those most significant aspects. And for those organisations that I've been working with on the revised 14001, they're still finding significant aspects in relation to their own specific activity, whether that's producing a product or delivering a service. But they're also really now beginning to highlight that although they might not control fully these other aspects relating to procurement or perhaps use of their product or delivery of their service are significant. In addition, 14001 talks about providing information about potential significant environmental impacts during use, end-of-life treatment and final disposal, and during transport and delivery. And it also talks about including environmental requirements in the design stage and the procurement stage. All of those blue boxes, it does sort of water down slightly by saying consider or where appropriate, but what it's trying to make us do is to really think about environment at those stages, something which 14001 didn't really drive organisations to do previously. However, ISO 14001 does not require a detailed life cycle assessment. The good news is that it does talk about careful thought about life cycle stages that can be controlled or influenced. And it's also important for us to be able to see this as a big opportunity, because all of a sudden organisations that previously didn't think about other stages of their life cycle are now being driven in that direction through ISO 14001. And I think I'm already seeing for some organisations that they're seeing real advantages in this. For those of you that are particularly interested in the wording around ISO 14001, the diagram I showed earlier, it really hopefully gave a sort of pictorial representation of what's on the screen at the moment. But you'll see in bold life cycle perspective, not life cycle assessment, but certainly the organisation taking a life cycle perspective and looking for environmental aspects at each stage of that life cycle. I said earlier that one of the main conceptual changes of ISO 14001 is really thinking about our stakeholders and our interested parties, as ISO 14001 calls them. And you'll see on the screen in front of you a number of different examples of stakeholders. Many of those are internal stakeholders within our organisation, whether that's within our organisation, direct organisation, or perhaps because they're part of another corporate entity. And one of the things that I'm finding most positive about my interactions with organisations in relation to ISO 14001:2015 is the fact that we are engaging with other departments that weren't previously involved. You know, procurement, we can really engage them because we're talking about life cycle. R&D, HR, sales and marketing, they're all beginning to see the advantages that environmental management systems can bring. And I think the life cycle approach is something that really does help in terms of engaging those internal stakeholders. One thing I just want to mention before I hand back to Jim is that ISO 14001 does recognise control and influence. It recognises that although there might be a significant environmental impact occurring perhaps in the extraction of a raw material, if you've got no control and very little influence over that, then it might not be something that you want to manage through your environmental management system. So it still recognises that, you know, if you are a production facility, that the main things that you might want to focus on are energy waste, water use, for example, those things that I would say are more under your control than perhaps things that happen in terms of transport and delivery, where the impacts of air quality might be more directly related to your logistics provider than yourselves. But of course, we can influence those things through the way that we procure those services or the way that we interact with those services. And the further we get away from our organisation's boundaries, the less influence you might say that we have. But still, we might have significant influence that enables us to interact with these other stages of the life cycle. So the last thing I just want to say is that one of the things that organisations fear about the addition of a life cycle perspective in 14001 is that perhaps they just can't control. They just say, well, how can we do everything all over the place? We've got no control. And 14001 is not forcing us to do something. It's allowing us to consider where is most significant impact, but also where we have a high enough level of influence in order to be able to do something. So at this stage, I'm going to hand back over to Jim to complete the presentation, and I'll pop back at the end to answer any questions.
Well, great. Thank you, Greg. And so as Greg mentioned, it's easy to see how life cycle assessment can help in the development of environmental management systems in the new standard. And I think it's important to realize it doesn't have to be a detailed LCA or even an LCA that conforms to any standard in order to be valuable for this exercise. As a reminder, there are different levels of life cycle assessment, and I've summarized some of them here. So we have at the top the full LCA, which scrutinizes every aspect of the system. What's very common is a manufacturer-centric LCA, which is detailed primary data for the manufacturer and then perhaps some secondary data for most other upstream and downstream processes. We have streamlined LCA, which is some primary data if it's available, and then secondary data for gaps, and then perhaps a cutoff threshold. And then a hotspot analysis, which is a very, very quick analysis and evaluation of using secondary data for most or all major system processes. And so a company can utilize existing life cycle assessments to inform their effort. So if you have existing LCAs out there, use it in your EMS development. But even if you don't, a quick hotspot or streamlined analysis can be valuable too. And it's important to recognize some of the trade-offs depending on your approach. So, and the limitations should be recognized accordingly. So of course, the hotspot is quicker, cheaper, and doesn't require as much expertise. But there are some higher uncertainties, and that has to be recognized when you're interpreting results to inform the EMS. So I have a series of example products up here on the screen. And let's see, airplane, car, refrigerator, manufactured home, and reinforced concrete panels. And I've labeled the typical life cycle stages in different colors in each bar chart. And so you'll see that, you know, an airplane has very large use phase impacts because it uses a lot of fuel in its operation. Similarly, a car does as well. But as you go along the list here, refrigerator still uses a lot of energy, but more and more impact is coming from raw materials and manufacturing and perhaps even distribution, and all the way to reinforced concrete panels that has almost no use phase impact, and most of the impact is from raw material extraction and processing. And so these results may seem obvious to the people on the call who are LCA experts, but to a group of company leaders and stakeholders who are not experts and perhaps haven't seen something like this before, this can be an enlightening exercise and a powerful way to foster a common understanding and focus among those leaders. So, you know, an LCA can also be inform your stakeholders as an educational exercise in addition to informing your EMS. And depending on the complexity of your product line or operations, it might not take much to get you to this point. So while it's valuable for a variety of other reasons, a detailed LCA isn't necessarily required. And if you have existing detailed LCAs, it can certainly help inform these discussions as well. All right, so I said we were going to go over a case study, and here it is. Finning is the world's largest dealer of CAT machines, engines, equipment, and power solutions. And they were going through a recertification process last year to the latest 14001 standard. They also wanted to integrate this recertification with the rollout of a new sustainability strategy. So they combine those two exercises. And so it was important to engage the leadership, consider the context of the organization within the life cycle, consider interested parties, and we were also charged with developing a sustainability roadmap, and we implemented life cycle workshops in order to facilitate achieving these goals. And the life cycle workshop included representatives from each area of the business, and it looked at each stage in the life cycle and identified aspects at each of those stages. And it then evaluated the aspects to see if the stage and the aspects in that stage were significant. So this is an overview of the process that we used. It's, as Greg mentions, it's important to engage leadership and get them on board. So sometimes that means defining what sustainability is and developing a sustainability strategy. And so the leadership was, in this case, was important in doing those things. Establishing a vision. As part of the workshop, the participants envisioned what products and operations would look like in the medium term around 2020. So what would change from what they're like today? We also included discussions of risks and opportunities, which is essentially turned out to be like an internal materiality assessment and engaging those internal stakeholders that were participating in this process. And then context. You know, as Greg mentioned, a traditional problem with an EMS is that it's mostly, well, oftentimes it's an EHS function, environmental health and safety, and it operates in somewhat of a silo from the rest of the organization. And this exercise helps focus on the macro scale to help the company understand what helps and hinders their progress. So for example, in the UK, a pretty big topic of conversation last year was Brexit, and there's still some uncertainty around there. And so a company that's operating in the UK might consider that as part of their context discussion. Similarly, here in the US, we have some uncertainty about regulations and with the new administration and what that might look like going forward. So that might be also part of a context discussion as you're developing your 14001 EMS. And then, of course, talking about the life cycle, which was essentially a brainstorming exercise where there was distinct focus on each life cycle stage, determining the activities in each life cycle stage, what are the inputs and outputs at that stage that could have a significant environmental impact. And then finally, the roadmap, which was essentially the deliverable or output of the process, and that contained the overall environmental and sustainability strategy and action plan, as well as the traditional EMS. And Finning specifically wanted an overall sustainability strategy to be an outcome of the process. And the EMS essentially was the operational mechanism to achieve that vision. All right, so I mentioned that we engaged folks from around the organization, and this lists the departments where some of those folks come from. And, you know, for example, procurement, design, logistics, operations, sales, post-sales, they were all represented in the environmental aspects, in the identification of environmental aspects and evaluating what those aspects, the impact of those aspects might be. And so a great way to engage people in this manner is through a workshop scenario. Again, an interactive workshop that starts out with brainstorming and you know, you identify drivers and opportunities, you talk about what you're currently doing and potential improvements, and ultimately agreeing on what the next steps should be and what the focus should be. And then Sustainability Vision 2025, which was part of the roadmap. These are some key questions that we asked and you might find useful as you develop your own EMS. Where do we get our energy from and the different types of energy that we're consuming? What do we do with our waste? Where do we get our materials from? What will our products look like in the medium and maybe even long term? What happens to our product at the end of its life? What will our business model be? There are some business models that are transforming from just a traditional sales model to a lease model or a sharing model, and so that's causing change in some industries. How will we work going forward? Where will our sites be? Where will our suppliers be? What skills are we going to need? And who do we need to partner with to make this successful? Of course, risks and opportunities are a key part of the discussion. And this was really an output of that materiality assessment, that internal materiality assessment that I mentioned earlier. So these are some of the key topics and risks and opportunities that were identified. You'll see here that engineer utilization is one of the topics that you might not normally see in a sustainability strategy, but it's important to recognize that Finning they're not manufacturing these the equipment that they're selling, and one of the key revenue sources that is their engineer utilization. So that's a key performance indicator as far as the economic part of their sustainability goes. So that was a part of this discussion. And then I mentioned it's important to discuss the context. See, these are some of the macro context topics that we discussed with Finning, and these are probably a bit more broad than other EMS processes because they wanted to look at a broader view of sustainability in the process. And so I mentioned these, and Greg alluded to these before. And then this is what I can show you as the output of the life cycle workshop. And so this is essentially a scoring methodology that's based on significance and level of control, as well as potential consequences for each category. And so for each of these, there's a scale of 1 to 5. So for something that has a high degree of control and a high severity of consequences, then that has a red box, and meaning that that's certainly an area of focus. And so for each of the life cycle stages that they identified, they essentially gave each stage a score from 1 to 5 based on each of these scales. And this is what it looks like. You can see that these are some of the same life cycle stages that Greg introduced earlier, and you can see that there's two scores for each of the stages, and they multiplied them together to get a single score for each stage, and the three highest life cycle stage scores were in sales, procurement, and logistics, according to their operations and how they fit into the larger life cycle of the product system. And for those organizations where environmental improvement has stagnated, or where site improvement is increasingly harder to find or justify, then this life cycle approach can help rejuvenate that EMS and make sure at least you're focusing on the right things. And then here's the result. The roadmap was it looked all the way to 2025, which was 9 years ahead at the time. There were also specific actions that were identified in the next 2 years at the time that it was concluded to 2018 to move them along the path to achieve the 2025 goals, which were also part of the roadmap. And there was also, as I mentioned, cross-functional input on these items from across the organization. And this roadmap really coordinates the sustainability journey of finning. And I want to conclude just by saying that if you remember nothing from the presentation, I think a good high-level message here is that environmental management systems, they've commonly operated in a silo, and the new standard can help the EMS be more inclusive and more collaborative between not only EHS, but also product teams, leadership, as well as other parts of the organization. And it's easy to see how life cycle assessment, even at a rudimentary level, can help guide the focus of the EMS. And so here's some potential next steps that we're trying to take with finning, which is completing a hotspot LCA a little bit more than the rudimentary analysis that I just showed you, and then confirming the results are consistent with stakeholder understanding and that the EMS is appropriately focused. And there's the contact information and the website for Greg and I certainly thank you for your time. And